Okay, so thank you to all of you for waiting at the waiting room, and welcome to this second design webinar that is organized by the International Dairy Federation. This event is part of the European project called Disarm, and the webinar, as you can see, will be entitled "Management of Calves from Birth to Weaning." Let's go into second slide. I'll tell you that Disarm is an active network. Is dedicated to finding innovative solutions for antibiotic resistance. And the project aims to reduce antibiotic resistance by reducing the need for antibiotics in livestock farming by focusing on disease prevention and prudent use of antibiotics. So please, if you want to know more about the project, check the Disarm website. There's quite some materials prepared by the members of the project, which are in the next slide, and they cover all the livestock species. Today we have with us 4 renowned professionals. They're working on calf management. Each of them will provide a short presentation, and you can ask questions using the chat box on Zoom. And also please remain muted and with the video off. And with this, I will just introduce you. Our chair of today is Dr. KERSTIN BARTH. She's from the University of, from the German THÜNEN Institute of Organic Farming. And she's also leading the work on calf management at IDF. KERSTIN, the floor is yours.
So, very well, warm welcome from me as well. It's nice to have you here today. As Maria already told you about the Disarm project, I will just give you a short introduction in the work of the action team managing calves from birth to weaning. This is an action team that's founded last year or the beginning of this year, and we had already one webinar, and this webinar focused on cow-calf contact systems, and this one is the second one for us. And as one of the tasks of the action team is to showcase best practices and also common practices of calf rearing under different and very various conditions. I'm very happy that today we can see how calves are reared in 3 different, very different countries from 3 different continents. So I think I will just start with the first presentation and introduce our first speaker. And this is Jennifer van Os, and she is an assistant professor and extension specialist at the University of Wisconsin. And Jennifer worked with renowned scientists at the University of California in Davis and also at the University of British Columbia. And as I know, she's very active in the International Society of Applied Ethology. And one of the goal of her extension program, as I read it, is to promote best practices in management and housing. And today, Jennifer will talk about single and group housing in calves, and I'm looking forward to her presentation. And just to mention, as Maria already said, if you have any comments or any questions, please type them in the chat box. We will have at the end of the presentations enough time to discuss the questions as well. So enjoy the first presentation.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me. And if at any time you have trouble hearing me, please do speak up. So thanks again. So here's the outline for my brief presentation today. I want to start just by giving a bit of context about the US dairy industry and pre-wean calf rearing practices in general. And then I want to just discuss a few health and welfare considerations for additional context. And then I will go over various housing practices, which is what I was asked to focus on. And then I'm also going to describe some milk feeding practices that I think have some important health and welfare implications. So this is a heat map of dairy farms in the United States by state. And so the darker regions represent a greater density of dairy farms. So the states with the darkest colors have 2,000 or more dairy farms. So Wisconsin has currently approximately 7,000 dairy farms, for example. And I just want to show you this distribution so that you can see where most farms are located. All of this does not show where most cows or calves are actually located. And some of the data that I'll be presenting today was taken from a report published by the United States Department of Agriculture, or USDA, in 2016, but the data were collected in 2013 and 2014. So periodically, the USDA puts out these reports to describe current management practices. And you can see that they sampled dairy farms from 17 out of 50 states. So they selected states that they consider major dairy producing. But you can see it's not completely representative of all the states in the US that have farms, which is that inset in the lower right. In addition to presenting the USDA data, we also collected data in a survey last fall. So in late 2019, myself and colleagues distributed an online survey. And so we were able to capture responses from dairy producers and calf raisers in 30 out of 50 states in the US. And so this actually includes some states that weren't in the USDA sample. And so if you compare this to the heat map of dairy farms on the lower right, you can see that we did have a higher concentration of responses in certain states near Wisconsin, in the upper Midwest, as well as the Northeast of the United States. And one of the striking things that it was seen in our sample was the great variation in herd sizes. And what we found was that some dairy farms raise their own heifers, but then there are also farms who specialize in raising heifer calves. So we sometimes call these calf ranches or custom growers. And so they don't milk any cows, they only raise calves. So out of the dairy farms, the mean number of pre-wean heifers on the day of the response was 187 calves, but the range was 1 calf to 24,000. And for the farms specializing in calf raising, the mean was over 4,500 calves, with a range from, again, just 1 heifer to over 81,000 heifer calves on the day of the survey. So what this is meant to convey is that there really is no one typical farm type. Dairy farming and calf raising in the US is very diverse, and they're diverse in the size of their herds, the types of facilities, and their management practices. One thing I would like to note also is, as you could see in the previous map, not all farms raise their own heifers. So most heifers are raised on the farm where they're born. So across the US, 92% of farms, according to the USDA, raise at least some of their own heifer replacements on site. And if we're looking at all heifers being raised on site, that's approximately 2/3 of farms. So then if we're looking at it by number of heifer calves instead of by number of farms, nearly 3/4 of heifer calves are raised on the farm where they're born. If we're looking only at large farms, which were considered those with over 500 milking cows, approximately half of those large farms outsource their heifer rearing. So the calves are born on the farm, but then they're sent to these custom growers. And for these larger farms, the majority of these operations send their calves to the custom growers before weaning. So on average, when calves are only 7 days old, they're put on a truck and sent to these custom growing operations. So in contrast with the small and medium-sized farms, which we would consider under 500 milking cows, the majority of heifers who are sent for custom growing are not sent off until they're already weaned. So some of these smaller operations are also outsourcing their heifer raising, but it's post-weaning. And most commonly in either of these situations, the heifers return to the dairy farm once they're pregnant. And so I'm just providing this for context. And for the sake of this presentation, I will not distinguish between heifer calves raised on dairy farms and those raised by custom growers. So next, I just want to provide a little bit of context about some health and welfare considerations in the US. So traditionally, within the US dairy industry and among dairy scientists and animal scientists, there's been a great emphasis on promoting calf health, growth, and productivity, rather than other aspects of welfare. So of course, there are many frameworks for studying and discussing animal welfare science, and I'm showing Dr. David Fraser's 3 spheres here. And our emphasis in the US has traditionally been on aspects of biological functioning and health. And so primarily because of this emphasis on health, over half of US farms and the vast majority of heifers are separated from the dam within 6 hours of birth. And so in addition to discussing calf health, I will also focus on 2 additional topics. So this would be individual and social housing of pre-weaned calves, as an example of how attention is growing in terms of behavioral needs aspects of welfare. And then I'll also touch upon milk feeding practices, because these have important implications for calf health, growth performance, and abnormal oral behaviors. Outside of the scope of this presentation would be painful routine procedures, for example, which are very relevant to welfare, but not about housing. So in the last 20 years, based on data that have been collected, we have seen significant improvements in calf mortality before weaning. So excluding stillbirths that occur within the first 24 hours after birth, the mortality rates were recently estimated to be about 6% overall, and that's compared to 11% in the late 1990s. And this is in part due to improvements in colostrum management, which has resulted in greater rates of successful passive immunity transfer. So on average, colostrum is fed about 3.5 hours after the calves are born. And according to the USDA, larger dairy operations feed colostrum sooner than smaller operations. So on larger farms with over 500 milking cows, colostrum is fed on average 2 hours after birth. And the highest mortality rates are typically seen within the first 2 to 3 weeks of a calf's life across various studies that have reported those values. So the reason that single housing has been the norm in the United States over the last few decades is in part because of this focus on health. So due to concerns about calf mortality and morbidity, social isolation has been seen as a key tool for reducing the risk of calf-to-calf disease transmission. So by separating the calves and essentially quarantining them from each other for the entire pre-weaning period, this reduces direct contact between calves, as well as their shared aerosol and contamination of shared feeding equipment or bedding. In addition, there are some management advantages that producers have cited. So when calves are housed separately, you can control how much they're fed and monitor individual feeding. And of course, now there has been modern automated technologies that we'll touch upon momentarily. In addition, when calves are housed singly, it is easier to handle them individually for husbandry practices. And so this practice is actually part of the heritage of my own research institution. So here's a page that's taken from a booklet about the history of the Marshfield Agricultural Research Station in Wisconsin. And in the 1960s, researchers were doing work that led to the eventual development of the single calf hutch that's manufactured by Hampel Corporation, also known as Calftel, which is about an hour outside of Madison. And interestingly, this company now is interested in pair housing. So we have been collaborating on systems that can promote pair housing. So the interesting thing to note, though, is despite the attention on health and focus on individual housing as a way to contain disease transmission over the last few decades, we have not seen significant improvements in calf morbidity rates over the same time period, although mortality has fallen. So approximately a third of pre-weaned calves in the US experience illnesses, primarily digestive or respiratory diseases. And other research has shown that social separation of calves is not the only way, nor the best way to maintain calf health. And in addition to this limitation, we now know there are many other welfare benefits to not rearing calves in isolation. In recent years, we've seen interest growing in these other aspects of calf welfare besides health, particularly when it comes to social rearing, which has numerous benefits that's been shown by the research over the last 20 years. So for the sake of time, I won't go into detail, but many of these benefits include the calves' improved social and cognitive development, as well as their growth performance, and more recently, some evidence that social housing could improve public acceptance of dairy farming practices. In terms of health outcomes in social housing, meaning pairs of groups, the evidence is mixed across different studies. But it's important to note that multiple factors contribute to calf morbidity. And isolation rearing is, again, not the only nor the best solution for promoting good calf health. And many of the same management principles apply for successfully rearing healthy calves, regardless of whether they're housed individually or in social groups. So I won't go into detail in any of these management risk factors that have been identified by the research, but I just want to list them here so you can keep them in mind when we go over the housing systems and milk feeding practices that I'll touch upon next. And many farms have been able to successfully raise healthy calves in pairs or groups, while other farms may not quite be ready yet before they transition from individual to social housing. So they might want to take a look at these management practices and make sure everything is in good shape before making the change. So now we'll discuss common housing practices. So in the USDA survey, they reported that 75% of dairy farms, so again, this isn't based on the number of calves, it's based on the number of farms, house their pre-wean heifers without full social contact before weaning. So the most common single housing type that they found was outdoor individual housing, which is this light shade of yellow on the right, closely followed by individual indoor housing. And so all of the yellow shades here represent individual housing. They found that less than a quarter of farms use some kind of social housing, but they did not break this down by group sizes or some of the common housing types that we see. So in our survey in 2019, we did ask some more specific questions about social housing. And we found very similar rates of individual housing. So 77% instead of 75% of farms house their calves only individually through the pre-weaning period. And as with the USDA, we found that outdoor individual housing was the single most common system, and that was followed by indoor individual housing. Some farms used a combination of indoor and outdoor individual housing, which is the darker shaded yellow. And then the remainder, which are in shades of green, used either only social housing through the pre-weaning period or a combination of some calves being housed individually and some calves being housed in pairs or groups. So we categorize those all as at least some social housing. And of the farms that used at least some social housing for their calves, 61% of them kept calves in groups of 2 to 8, which we consider smaller groups, and then 39% used groups of more than 8 calves. So I just want to show quickly some examples of what outdoor individual housing can look like, because again, this is highly variable across individual farms within and across regions. So individual calf hutches can be made of either plastic or wood, and there are regional differences where these wood hutches are more common out west, for example, in California, and those are shown at the bottom. In terms of the plastic hutches, which are in the top row, calves commonly have some sort of outdoor access. So either they could have a fenced outdoor area as shown on the left, or they could be tethered to the hutches and have outdoor access at the end of the chain. So that's shown on the right. With the wooden hutches, calves do not typically have outdoor access. So the USDA report indicated that on farms that house pre-wean heifers in individual outdoor hutches, about 94% provide extra bedding or a windbreak or a combination of these resources during the winter season, and that's regardless of the region or their climate. So there is a change in management in the winter. And now I'd like to show some examples of what typical indoor housing can look like for individually housed calves. So with indoor pens, some individual pens allow limited contact, so not full social contact, but fence line contact between adjacent calves. So that's what you can see in the upper left, whereas other individual pens have solid panels, and these can vary in design. So some of these individual pens now are modular, so they allow for easy removal of the panels between calves to create pairs or small groups. And these modular systems are increasingly being marketed by companies that make either the plastic pens, like shown in the upper right, or those that make systems that have metal frames and panels, as shown on the bottom. And typically in indoor housing systems, dairy calves are provided bedding, although that's not the norm for veal calves in contrast. And one thing I wanted to note is that indoor housing provides shelter from the elements for the calves and for the workers. But ventilation is an important risk factor for health issues with indoor housing. In our survey last year, we also asked farmers about the degree of social contact that they allowed for calves that were housed individually. So of these farms using only individual housing, nearly 2/3 allowed the calves at least visual contact. And about 29% allowed some of their calves tactile contact as well, which would be through the fencing panels that divide the pens, as you saw in the previous slide. Very few farms, so about 6.5%, did not allow any sort of contact, whether that's visual or tactile. So even though the percent of farms that house their calves only individually is still quite high in the US, to me this represents a great opportunity for extension outreach on social rearing of calves. So in my position, I conduct research, but I also do outreach with the dairy industry. And so in our survey, we asked farmers, are you interested in learning more about social housing? So among the farmers who currently house their calves only individually, 36% indicated that they were in fact interested in hearing from us and that they wanted to learn about pair or group housing. So right now, where in-person workshops aren't possible anymore, I'm working on a series of educational fact sheets on this topic to help producers make the decision about how to transition successfully to pair or group housing, depending on their individual management practices, because there is a lot of diversity and not every farm is quite ready yet. So we're working on giving them information about how to make that call. So within our survey, we also asked about what kinds of housing systems farms are using for social groups. And we found again that the housing styles are very diverse. So there's no single typical strategy for calf housing, and that's especially the case for social housing. So in the next few slides, I'll show all indoor housing in the green shades, and then outdoor housing is blue. So oftentimes when we say group housing, people make an association with large groups of calves with automatic milk feeding systems. And these types of farms represented about 29% of the farms in our sample who used social housing. But the most common social housing type was actually indoor housing with manual feeding of milk. So 46% of farms total used indoor housing. And these were evenly split between mob feeding, which you can see an example of on the right, where a group of calves shares a milk source. And then the other half used individual manual feeding, and that's shown on the left, where each calf within a group has its own bucket or bottle, such as these nipple buckets that are shown there. And then lastly, about 26% of the farms in our sample did their social housing outdoors. And so this was either by connecting individual hutches using a shared fence, as you can see on the left, or using what we call super hutches, which are intended for group housing of calves. And you can see an example on the right. There's actually a pair of calves in there. You just can't see the second one behind. And just a little more information about this pair hutch systems. This has been explored in several recent studies in the US and Canada, including in my own lab. And this strategy is being deployed at scale in some instances. So my PhD student is from Texas, and she visited a calf ranch there who keeps over 600 heifer calves on milk at a given time. And they've been using this strategy now for about 2 or 3 years. And this method of combining individual hutches into pairs does have some limitations, but we think that it may be a feasible low barrier or low cost option for farmers who want to keep their existing individual hutches and minimize infrastructure investment while moving to pair housing. So my last point under housing is just a brief note about space allowance. So there are no national standards for space allowance for dairy calves in the US. There was some recent state legislation in California for veal calves, and there are recommendations that are published in educational resources in the industry. And these vary from 30 square feet per calf to 35 or even 40, depending on who's writing it. And one thing to note is that this 30 square feet recommendation already exceeds the typical space allowance that we see in many of these individual calf pens indoors, as well as the indoor portion of calf hutches used outdoors. So in the case of calf hutches, if the calves do have some sort of outdoor access, and that space is included, then that exceeds this minimum recommendation. But sometimes that outdoor space shouldn't be considered resting space because in inclement weather, that outdoor area can become wet. So I just want to mention milk feeding practices briefly before we wrap up. So one of the questions that the USDA asked farmers was how much milk they were feeding, milk or milk replacer they were feeding to pre-weaned calves. And traditionally in the US industry, there's been an emphasis on an accelerated transition from liquid to solid feeds. So a common industry recommendation has been to feed calves only 4 quarts, which is 3.8 liters per day. So according to these USDA data, which again were published in 2016, but collected in 2013 and 2014, many farms still routinely underfeed milk. So 56% of farms fed 5 or fewer quarts per day, which is 4.7 liters. And only 22% of farms were feeding at least 8 quarts a day, or 7.6 liters. One caveat to note is that the USDA did not indicate the age for this feeding level. So they only said this was before weaning. And they did note that 61% of farms do adjust the milk allowance depending on calf age or calf size. So in our survey, which was collected last year, we specifically phrased the question to ask farmers about the amounts of milk or replacers that they feed to their 4-week-old calves to try to capture the peak of milk feeding. And again, this is in quarts because that's what most farmers think in terms of here. So we're showing the farms that only use single housing in yellow and the farms that use some social housing in green. And what we found was actually that 50% of farms who house their heifers only in individual housing actually feed 8 quarts or more. And 66% of the farms that use some social housing also feed at least 8 quarts per day. So this is much better than what the USDA had reported. And we know that milk allowance is very important for calf health, growth performance, and because greater volumes of milk or milk replacer have been shown by the research to reduce abnormal oral behavior such as cross-sucking. So in addition to our data being more recent, we also may have captured a different population. So the USDA surveyed farms in 17 states that were considered major dairy producing states, and we were able to capture responses in 30 states, although we know our sample isn't representative of all farms either. So instead, we believe our sample represents farmers who access information digitally and who seek out extension outreach materials either from universities or industry partners. So it's possible that continuing education plays a role in how much farmers are feeding. So lastly, we also asked about how milk was being fed. So with the USDA, they reported that 77% of all dairy farms use bottles, but also that 72% of all farms use buckets. And that's because many farms use both methods. It's common to have calves start being hand-fed from bottles at birth, and then they're switched to buckets soon after. So the USDA data aren't really useful in explaining how calves are fed for the majority of the pre-weaning period. So in our survey, we specifically asked how calves were fed for the majority of time before they were weaned. And we found that among the farms that use social housing, which are shown on the right, 80% fed milk or milk replacer through a teat. So this would either be a bottle or a teat bucket or an automatic milk feeder, so that's shown in green. And having a teat provides an outlet for the calf's suckling behavior and has been shown to be a practice that reduces cross-sucking and other abnormal, non-nutritive oral behaviors. For the farms using only individual housing, which are on the left, only 29% fed milk through a teat, and the other 71% used either buckets or open troughs for milk, so those are shown in blue. And this means that on these farms, not only do the calves have less social contact, but they also lack appropriate outlets for their highly motivated suckling behavior. So now I'll just summarize the points from my presentation. So first, it's important to emphasize that US farms vary greatly in their herd size and the housing systems they use for their calves. There's no single typical farm type. And individual housing of pre-weaned calves remains the norm in the US, in part due to this traditional emphasis on this practice on the basis of promoting good health. However, although pre-weaning mortality has decreased over the last couple decades, this has not been the case for morbidity, which still affects approximately a third of all heifer calves. We now have some promising data suggesting that the norm might be moving away from restricted milk allowances of 4 quarts per day. And we have evidence that many farms, especially those who are housing calves in social groups, now feed twice as much, meaning 8 quarts per day. But The majority of farms feed milk using open buckets or troughs, which do not provide an appropriate outlet for highly motivated suckling behavior. We've also found that interest in social housing is growing, with over a third of farmers who currently individually house their calves indicating interest in learning about pair or group housing. We also saw that farms already using social housing also use other welfare-friendly practices, such as feeding greater milk allowances and feeding through a nipple. So as my final take-home message is, in the last 2 decades, we have seen some improvements in calf health in the US industry, but many opportunities still remain to improve calf health and welfare, including social, environmental, and feeding complexity. Social housing is done only on a minority of farms, but farmers who house calves individually are interested in learning more about social housing, which has many beneficial implications for calf welfare. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for these nice presentations. Really interesting, I think. And the first questions are coming in, and I think we will answer them in our question and answer time at the end of the presentations. So let's move on to our next speaker. That's JULIE FØSKE Johnsen. Sorry, I'm always in the English form. It's JULIE is from the Norwegian Institute, a Veterinary Institute. And in our first webinar, she presented the Smart Calf Care project. And that was a really, or is still a really innovative approach to cow-calf contact systems in dairy farms with milking robots. But today, JULIE will talk about the pre-weaning management of calves in Norway, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kerstin. Can you see the presentation? Everything is in order?
I think you should switch over to the presentation mode. I think we are in the speakers mode on.
Okay, I see. Sorry. I'll try again. Better?
Yes.
Okay,
that's
good.
fine. Thanks.
Okay, good. So thank you so much for the invitation to share our recent research. I work in the research group of animal welfare at the Norwegian Veterinary Institute in Norway. And I'd like to start off today with sharing a belief of mine. I believe that there's a huge unexploited potential in optimizing the pre-weaning calf management, both with and without the cow. And this presentation deals with artificial calf rearing and data from a survey on the pre-weaning calf management conducted among Norwegian dairy farmers. And in my opinion, the vast amount of research on conventional calf rearing should be acknowledged and also form the basis for systems where cow and calf are allowed contact. It's really interesting to see that the results from the survey by Jennifer, you will see that we will have the same interest in our research questions, because first some words about the background. So as Jennifer also mentioned, there's a bunch of new knowledge gained by intensive research on the area of calf health management and welfare during the last years, especially from the University of British Columbia. And as an example, the term calf comfort has been introduced, accompanied by the expectation that calf welfare will be highlighted just as much as cow comfort has been in the spotlight during the last years. So to put it extremely short, the needs of cows have been documented. And consequently, we now need to think differently in the future with respect to how calves are reared. Firstly, restricted milk allowances, a calf feeding program that was introduced in the 50s to aid calves transfer from liquid to solid diet as soon as possible. And research now shows that calves are motivated to drink far more milk than allowed for in restricted milk feeding programs. It also shows that these calves are hungry in performing both vocalizations, unrewarded visits to the feeder, and also cross-sucking. There's also a huge gap in how these calves grow during the first months of their life and their potential to grow. And in parallel, we now know that there are benefits of housing dairy calves socially from an early age, as mentioned by Jennifer. The benefits increase with the complexity of the social environment and can be exemplified by improved intake of solid feed, social buffering during weaning, improved cognitive skills, etc. And the UBC researchers have greatly advanced the area of this research. So these findings led us to ask how calves are fed and housed in Norwegian dairy herds. In addition, we wanted to know whether most dairy herds in Norway actually comply with legislation relevant for calf welfare in general and during the pre-weaning period specifically. Minimum standards are stated in Norwegian legislation, as for example, calves should be fed twice daily, calves should have access to soft and insulated lying spaces, and calves can only be housed in single pens for a maximum of 8 weeks. Lastly, we also wanted to find out whether there is an association between calf management, compliance to current legislation, and herd dairy calf mortality, a crude indicator of calf welfare at dairy herds. I will now explain how we performed this study. In 2016, veterinary inspectors from the Food Safety Authority in Norway visited 912 dairy herds. These were randomly selected from the population of Norwegian dairy farmers. The focus of the visit was to perform a calf welfare inspection, aiming at calves less than 6 months of age. At herd level, 11 criteria were assessed as satisfactory or not satisfactory. These criteria were, for example, calf housing, calf feeding, colostrum management, lying space, housing in single pen, etc. And each of the criteria were evaluated based on the minimum standards formulated in current legislation. And all of the visited herds received a questionnaire on pre-weaning calf management. And as you will notice, we focus on young dairy calves, exemplified as 3-week-old dairy calves. The reason why we chose this age is that we know that calves at this young age cannot yet compensate low milk allowances by other feedstuffs. In this short questionnaire, we asked how much milk was fed to 3-week-old dairy calves and how many meals per day. We asked whether and how milk allowance was changed during the recent years, and it was also asked if milk replacer was used and if yes, from what age. Further, we asked if 3-week-old dairy calves had free access to fresh water, yes or no. And lastly, we asked for how many weeks calves were housed in single pens and the barn type. 508 dairy herds responded to the questionnaire, which leaves a respondents rate of 56%. And from the herds that responded to the questionnaire, we collected herd level data on calf mortality and disease treatments for 2016. This data was collected from a central database, the Norwegian Cattle Health Services, where almost all dairy herds participate and share their data. As a result, a data set was formed with all herds that had data from the calf welfare inspection, the questionnaire, and the calf management questionnaire. And as a result, we found 431 herds that were matched in all 3 data sources. The 2 aims of this study were as follows. Firstly, to describe housing and feeding of young dairy calves. And I will present the results in detail today. And secondarily, we wanted to investigate associations between calf management, compliance to welfare legislation, and calf mortality. And now to the results of the survey. I think I should mention that the Norwegian dairy herds are somewhat different from the US dairy herds, since our herd size is much smaller. So in our population, the mean herd size was around 25 milking, lactating dairy cows. So far less herd size. But we found that herds reported that the median daily milk allowance fed to 3-week-old dairy calves was 7 liters per day. And as you can see on the figure to the right, the distribution shows a highly varying milk allowance. It ranged from less than 3 liters per day up to ad libitum milk allowances, which was registered as 15 liters per day. Industrial recommendations in Norway now state that young calves should receive 8 liters of milk per day at a young age, which corresponds to 3-week-old dairy calves. However, our survey indicates that most herds, and 61%, reportedly feed less than current industrial recommendation. 76 herds and 15% feed less than 6 liters of milk per day, and 17 herds and 3% feed less than 4 liters per day. And although the survey might have missed details on milk feeding levels that might have been higher during other parts of the milk feeding period, we think that we have asked about the most critical period of the calves' pre-weaning phase. These findings indicate that most of the researched herds, which most likely constitute a representative sample of Norwegian dairy herds, still feed restricted milk allowances to young dairy calves. Recent research showed that calves are motivated to drink around 10 to 12 liters of milk per day from nipples, and even more, up to 15, 16, and 20 liters when they are suckling their dam. Due to the young age of these calves, they are not capable of compensating a low milk allowance with other feedstuffs as hay and concentrate, even if they are available. And as mentioned before, restricted milk allowances are associated with hunger, low growth, and prevention from performing natural behaviors, and therefore poor welfare. This indicates that there's room for improving the milk feeding management of young dairy calves in Norway. And calves should be fed enough milk to feel satiated, at least during the first 4 weeks. Now, recent research actually indicates that feeding more milk resulting in high growth during the pre-weaning phase actually pays off, because average daily gain during the pre-weaning phase explains around 20% of the first lactational yield. Therefore, I think we should go into the discussion whether elevated milk allowance to dairy calves actually should be considered as milk loss or as an investment. Because when provided ad libitum milk in artificial systems, calves will drink as much as they need to cover their nutritional needs. And the pre-weaning phase is the most efficient period of growth, and with regards to turning their nutrients into growth. So I think that the direct link between pre-weaning growth and production is now established, and therefore increased milk allowances may probably be considered more as an investment than a milk loss. And I'd like to encourage a discussion on whether new guidelines should focus on milk satiety, especially during the first weeks of life. And now to the results on milk feeding frequency. The survey indicates that the median milk feeding frequency of 3-week-old dairy calves is 3 times per day. Most herds, and 47% of the herds, feed milk twice daily, which is equal to the minimum standard stated in current Norwegian legislation. 56 herds and 12% feed 4 times per day. And 226 herds and 46% use milk replacer from the age of 2 weeks. And this indicates that half of the herds feed whole milk to their calves, and they especially use this milk feeding method during the first weeks of the calf's life. Automatic milk feeders is used in 29 herds. And by programming the automatic feeders, milk feeding behaviors can correspond to the ones shown by natural behavior when cow and calf have contact to each other. Because dairy calves suckling the dam spend around an hour suckling per day, and they divide their milk intake on 5 to 10 meals per day. And allowing for increased meal sizes and more milk, calves seem capable of regulating their milk meals across the day. And this recent research from Ellingsen and co-authors have investigated the capacity of the calf's abomasum for milk. And they found that even in cases of voluntary intake of 7 liters a meal, there was no evidence of leakage into the rumen. So it shows that the abomasum has a very large capacity to enlarge with milk. And again, these findings indicate that calves safely can be fed bigger milk meals. With regards to housing, we found that calves reportedly were housed in single pens for 2 weeks only. It ranged from 0 to 16 weeks after birth. And as I said previously, in Norway, calves may be housed in single pens for up to the age of 8 weeks. So most herds group their calves far earlier than they have to. This is positive due to the benefits that have been revealed by socially housing dairy calves from an early age. And and it's a very positive signal, I think. With regards to water access, 420 herds reported that calves had free access to water at the age of 3 weeks. However, 82 herds and 16% report that this is not the case. And actually, free access to water for dairy calves is actually not mandatory. It's just mandatory in case of high temperatures or illness. And on the basis from feedback from the Norwegian Food Safety Authority, lack of free water access was often seen during the period when calves were housed in single pens, as seen on the picture. In general, in this survey, we found that very few herds did not comply to minimum standards. So we did not find a lot of variation in the measure of compliance to current legislation. And with regards to the results on calf mortality, we found that 25.9% of the herds had no registrations of calf mortality during 2016. And we also found that the median calf mortality rate was 6.4%, and that regards then all cows from 0 to 6 months of age, and also including stillborn calves. We did not find any associations between calf feeding management or whether or not the herds were complying to welfare legislation and calf mortality. However, we did find associations between the herds that reportedly did not allow free access to water at the age of 3 weeks and calf mortality. So these herds not providing water at this age had higher risk of herd calf mortality. Herds that treated calves for diseases also had higher risk for calf mortality. So I'd like to sum up these results. And I think this survey indicates that there is a room for improvement among Norwegian dairy farmers. We can safely feed more milk to the dairy cows, and we can feed fresh water and free access to fresh water. It's positive to see that most dairy cows are grouped early. There's an abundant use of whole milk among Norwegian dairy farmers, and it's positive that these calves are grouped at an early age. And we also found an association between calf disease treatments and calf mortality. So we are thinking about whether these variables can be used in risk assessment in the future. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and the results from this survey can be found in a study in short time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Julie, so much for your nice presentation and the interesting data on the Norwegian way to rear calves. We move now, last not least, to a very growing dairy industry, I have to say, to China. And I'm happy that SNORRI SIGURDSSON from the China-Denmark Milk Technology Cooperation Center found the time to present the ways of calf rearing in China today. So the floor.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, it's 2 o'clock in the morning here, so it's my pleasure to share some information with you. I'm gonna see if I can share the screen. You should be seeing my screen now, right?
It's fine, yeah.
Fine, good. So first of all, just a little bit about what this CDMTCC is. You can read about myself there, but this is like an extension service provided by Arla Foods, the dairy company in Europe, and the Chinese dairy company called Mengniu, which is the second biggest in China. And the reason these two companies are working together is because Arla Foods actually has some shares in Mengniu. And we have been here now for 12 years. It's a kind of an extension service where we provide expert knowledge on different management things for a young dairy industry as it is basically here in China. Just to give you a little bit heads up about the Chinese situation, because I reckon that not many have been here or even know how the industry is. We have quite young, recently built it up, dairy industry in China. So we have new farms with thousands of cows, but we still have, as you see in the average, we don't have access to much data in China, to be honest, but we have some. And the average in 2018 was only 16 cows, so actually lower than we heard from Norway. But basically the reason for this is that we have a vast amount of farms with only one cow for home or two cows. So these are not industry farms or selling milk to others, but they are considered dairy farms in Chinese data. The company we work for or work mainly with is Magnu. Our average size farms have now close to 1,000 cows, about 960 cows average. And our milk in volume is somewhere around 6 billion kilos yearly. We have seen drastic change in the number of farms in the last decade or so, reduced by 75% since 2007. And the yearly production now is about 33 billion kilos, and it's actually growing about 4 to 5% yearly, and will continue to grow like that in the years to come, based on decisions by the authorities here in China. This picture is actually quite good. It shows the change that happened in 2007, where you see the big red or brown or whatever the color is there on top. How the farms with 1,000+ cows are increasing drastically, and that is continuing now yearly. So we see that the number of farms with less than 100 cows are basically vanishing, and the bigger farms are taking over. How is situation in China? Sometimes I show this picture because China is actually quite big. It's difficult to say how it is exactly in all China. As you can see, it's the size of Europe, or at least West Europe. But if we look at the farms we are working with Magnu, that gives you some idea about at least the newer farms and how they are. We have seen a huge, like I said before, a huge change in the dairy farming industry here for the last years, and the last 5 to 7 years has been actually booming in the bigger farms, as you see on the pictures here. On the right top corner, you see a farm which has 15,000 cows in one place, and these drawings were simply copied. So this farming company has now 4 farms like this. So they have 60,000 cows altogether, with 4 rotaries in each farm. And on the bottom is the biggest farm in China with 20,000 milking cows in one place. So this is the environment we are working with, and so it's quite different from many other countries. Because the farms are newly built, and they are quite fancy, to be honest. Some pictures here to give you some idea about the farms here. Many of them are made by or owned by investors. They don't have traditional roots in farming, which is actually good for us working in the extension service, because they are quite good at listening, and they are quite good at following advice, because they don't have any roots in this. So they are following, I'm not saying blindly, but quite well to the advice we are giving those farms. Yeah, this is inside one of the farms, just to give you some heads up about what to expect if you come over here to visit us someday. Let's talk about the calves. The facilities are quite different, of course, depending on where the farms are placed in China. In the north, we see, like in the bottom to the left, isolated farms, closed buildings, and to the right bottom, you see a picture from a farm in the south, where the farms are very much open, because simply the weather conditions are quite good. The picture from the left, in this area, the frost is over 40, minus 40 Celsius when it's coldest in the winter time. When we talk about the calving, if we start from the scratch, most commonly we have some kind of group housing of the small calves in the beginning, like you see in the top left picture there. Some of those farms are providing some heating with light bulbs or something like that. But also, like you see in the picture to the right top, we also see this single hutches or boxes for the new calves. But my feeling is it's growing, that the group facility, like you see in the top left corner, is gaining or winning. There is actually quite good management around colostrum, at least on the farms we are servicing. They are all using colostrum banks. I have not visited one that does not carry a colostrum bank and does not measure the quality of colostrum. And again, this is mainly because they simply follow. They're quite good here in China to follow rules. And when we say what you should do, they simply do it. So that's actually quite good thing. How they do it and how they store the colostrum, of course, can be different, but most of them are doing this in this way, with a freezing boxes from Colo-Quick, which is almost in every farm, not all, but almost every. Then regarding the milk feeding period itself, usually they go in and are in single hutches. Like you see some kind of single hutches, as you see on the left. Group housing or pair housing is not common in China, not at all. And it's not gaining any ground. We haven't seen any trend in that direction so far. I think we can say for China, it's a little bit like you had in the States, where the focus is on health and productivity, not so much on behavior and other things or feelings, like you mentioned there. So over here, it's quite practical approach to dairy housing. Of course, some different, as you can see on the left, situation are seen, but thankfully they are vanishing quite much, and we hope we will see the end of this quite soon. Some farms are raising calves inside, and then it can be in where they are singly housed, but few, not many, have some calves in groups. But this is more rare than common, to be honest. I think these three pictures you see there on the right and in the bottom, I think that's all three pictures I found in my database, and I visited 150 farms out of 600 that we are buying milk from. So I have visited 25% of all the farms we have visited are buying milk from. So to be honest, it's not a common thing, but a little bit growing trend in this direction. At least in the advice we are giving, so we are trying to push this agenda somehow. The bedding, different angle from same farms. We have most commonly is sand bedding for the calves, and rice shells. It should be maybe their number two, because those two types of materials are the most commonly used. But then some of them use straw or timber or even plastic to stand on, or rubber, but that's not common. Most common is sand. If I should guess, I would guess 90%. Like I said before, the data is not good in China, so it's a little bit the feeling I have is that the majority are using sand, and then the rice shells are actually quite good and really comfortable for the calves. The milk feeding methods, using nipples is not common. Most of the farms are fed from buckets. In some cases, they're using milk bars, as you can see on the left, on the picture there on the right bottom. But most common is buckets, and the use of nipples is not at all common here. And automatic feeding systems are rare. I think I've seen in one farm on a display, not even in use. So I think I can honestly say that automatic feeding is not at all used. However, feeding with acidified milk is actually quite common, and that's growing, where the farmers are giving the calves free access to milk that has been acidified. And these systems are something we recommend for the farms. We have been making some recommendations about cleaning and so on, simply because we see the growth of the heifers is really good on those farms, usually around 1.05 or even 1.2 or 3 kilos per day for the Holstein heifer, which is quite good, at least in China. Our experience in China is that all farmers are giving some kind of concentrates from the beginning. From early age, they are getting concentrates. And that I say it's always like that, because I've never visited a farm that is not giving concentrates from almost day one, or access to it at least. However, hay or straw is rarely given to the small calves. So they are getting those muesli feeds or calf muesli or calf concentrates, but not access to straw or hay. Ventilation, when the calves are inside, usually it's overpressure systems, but outside, of course, they don't have any ventilation. However, we use cooling quite effectively in China for the small calves, and that's quite common and quite important, because we simply know that the heifers that are cooled simply grow faster. The picture to the right are actually from heifers that are not on milk, but that's a different story, but showing a fans keeping them a little bit more chilled. In the summertime, it's most common that we use some kind of shades to try to prevent heat stress in the calves. Some kind of fabric is put up temporarily over the summertime to give them some shade, and that is basically the method we use to cool or reduce their heat stress. And of course, they always get access to water. That is one of the demands we make in Magnus for our farms, that they give water access to fresh water from day 3. We also try to emphasize that protect the feet also from heating up, or so we have all kinds of different solutions out there. This is one example about how you can help the feet to also be out of the sun, and that also keeps the energy level of the concentrate up. We have, like I said, quite practical approach to calf management in China. We emphasize of use of KPIs, that the farmers weigh those calves. They have to weigh them, or well, they don't have to, but they should weigh them when they're born and when they are weaned. And we have a target growth of about 950 grams up to 1050 grams a day. Some are reaching, like I said before, more than that, but of course some are under 950. And last week I actually visited a farmer that as low as 800 grams per day, which is not satisfying for us. We know that those heifers will never be, or it will be difficult for them to be good cows. We also keep quite good control on the immunoglobulin in the colostrum, and our target is over 25 and preferably over 28. And basically we try to convince the farms and farm managers to register quite well. To be honest, the small calves registration is not good. They register the numbers and the weight, but they are not very good at registering problems like we see on the bottom there regarding mortality or so on. But we have a target of weaning at 55 days, or actually when the heifers are eating 1.5 kilos of concentrate 3 days in a row, we basically recommend that the farmers can stop giving them milk. Just to emphasize the calf weighing, it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be quite easy to do, and we should all over the world recommend our farmers to keep quite good control of the farm of the heifers, how they are growing, because otherwise we don't know if we're doing a good job or not. Before, my previous speakers were talking about the milk or volume of milk. We see I've never seen under 8 liters a day to the heifers. Or usually it's 8 up to 12 liters a day, and always milk from the farm. Farmers in China, they don't use powdered milk to make milk for the calves. So what is the main challenge here in the end with calf rearing in China, or at least in those farms we are servicing? We have some lung problems, and we have diarrhea, which is like every farmers all around the globe are fighting, but we are trying to have some systems to prevent this in the best way possible, to isolate the sick calves and so on if they're not already in isolation. The heat is an issue in China, and the sun, and I think today more or less all farmers are quite well educated on this and are doing some prevention to try to keep those heifers as cold as possible. We still have some farms that are not reaching 800 grams a day. Like I said before, I visited 7 farms last week, and one of them had under 800. So we are still seeing too low daily growth, which is something we need to improve. And maybe the big issue here is that almost all, if not every farm, is using antibiotic milk to feed the calves, which is, of course, something that we don't recommend. But with a commonly used blanket cow therapy here in China, there is a vast volume of milk that has some traces of antibiotics that the farmers are using. It's always pasteurized. All the farms are pasteurizing the milk, but it's still milk that we would not recommend to be used. Just at the end, if you have some interest in learning more about what we have been doing, we have a homepage where we have some reports and information on newsletters and so on. That was very quick about the situation in China.
Yeah, thank you so much, Snorri, for your nice presentation, and also that you were willing to spend your time so late in the evening to present the data from China. So we still have nearly 20 minutes left for the question and answer section, and I'd like to invite the speakers to switch on their micro, and I will go through the questions I can see in the chat. And I think we can start with Jennifer, but please, also the other speakers, please feel free. If you have any comments, then just jump in. Jennifer, there was a question from Chris van Dijk. You mentioned that the calves are moved on average at day 7, and what's the average minimum, was the question, and the maximum days before calves are moved to rearing facilities? And is there a rule?
The USDA did not report the ranges, so they only reported the means based on the herd size, and so that's where they found that for these large farms with at least 500 milking cows, the average is 7 days of age, whereas the smaller facilities actually raise their calves through weaning and then send them off. And so there actually aren't a lot of data, and there are no federal regulations. So there's a lot of discussion in the US industry about what should be our transportation guidelines, because a lot of these pre-wean calves that are being sent to these custom growing facilities actually are going on the first day of life or within the first 3 days of life. So even though the average is 7, there are a lot of younger calves. Now, some of these calves are only traveling short distances. So in Wisconsin, for example, some farms will have the calves be born and then they go to a local heifer grower within a few miles just down the road, but then some are sending them, 1,000, 2,000 miles. So there's a lot of variation. And again, there's no federal regulations right now. So this is a topic of great interest where more research is needed on transportation. And some of that research is happening in Canada. But yes, we need much more research to give us better guidelines on this practice, because I think there are some welfare concerns.
Yeah, I think so, definitely too. Another question, I think it's also or is some part of it is answered by SNORRI already, but maybe it's concerns in the American area as well. How do you manage heat stress in hutches, for example, in Texas?
Yes, so I'm very glad for that question. It was also very helpful that SNORRI showed those slides, because this is one of the areas of interest for my own research. So my PhD student who grew up in Texas now moved to Wisconsin. And so we're studying both heat stress and cold stress in pre-weaned calves. So for indoor systems, as he showed, fans have been shown to be helpful. And in outdoor systems, we can kind of translate that, where we know the first line of defense is shade. So if we don't block the calves from gaining solar radiation, they'll continue to overheat. So some of these plastic hutches are somewhat translucent and they create a greenhouse effect. So you need to provide shade from either trees or a shade cloth. Some of the hutches are actually opaque. And so we've measured the temperature inside and outside, and they don't actually overheat additionally. And the second thing is providing natural ventilation. So we don't provide mechanical fans outdoors, but now some of the plastic hutches have kits that you can purchase to modify them. So you cut a hole and there's a window you can close in the winter and open in the summer. So we have some preliminary data showing that actually helps a lot with the calves' respiration rates and makes them cooler. And that's even if there are 2 calves that choose to lay inside the same hutch in the case of pair housing. So that's one strategy. Other producers just raise the hutch on cinder blocks, or they build something to elevate it in the summer to allow more airflow. But great question.
Yeah, okay. Well, definitely a problem for us too, due to climate change, I have to say. Another thing concerning the hutches, pair housing seems a good solution, but what about the cleaning, which seems more difficult for the breeders?
Absolutely. So with indoor pair housing, some of the farms have reported labor savings, where cleaning a group pen is more efficient than cleaning the individual pens. But then outside, as I alluded to, that is one of the limitations of the pair hutch system. So we like to present that option to producers who are interested in pair housing, and currently they use individual hutches because to them it's a smaller step to now pair the hutches than to invest in purchasing group hutches or to build a barn. But that is one of the problems, because the research has shown that even though the calves have 1 hutch per calf and a shared outdoor area, oftentimes they like to lie together in the same hutch. And so then some producers think, oh, well, then I only need 1 hutch. And we strongly discourage that. We still think it's important to give calves the option to have that space. But yes, it does present a challenge for keeping the bedding clean. And so we collected some data. We haven't been able to analyze it yet to look at behavior in the winter, especially. We think pair housing can provide undiscovered benefits to help calves thermoregulate, but that could also mean that they're soiling the hutch more. So we're measuring bedding dry matter. But yes, that's an important concern.
Yeah. Another point on group housing was, did you have any data about the difference in morbidity when comparing individual or group housing?
No, so those data weren't available from that USDA data set. They're just reporting on the whole. But I think that that's an important question, because with these custom calf ranches, because they're not a milk harvesting facility, they don't have oversight from the USDA in the way that a dairy farm would. So there's very limited data comparing these types of farms. And so we do have a lot of questions about what are the management practices? What's the range of calf welfare and health outcomes on these custom operations? And there are efforts within the industry to try to reach out to these types of farms and provide more guidelines, because the focus has really been on dairy farms and not these dairy calves who are being raised not on dairy farms. So it's a good question, but I don't know.
So, and Nina from Kaiserling asked if you could clarify the definition of stillbirth as many, her understanding is that in terms of calf mortality, it means that they were born alive but died before they were 48 hours old.
Yeah, so she's right, and the definitions do vary. So I checked, and in the USDA, they do define it as between birth and 48 hours. So actually those mortality rates would be higher if you include between 24 and 48 hours. So what I was thinking of is we have an industry organization here called the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association, or DCHA. And so dairy farmers and calf growers are members of this organization that provides educational materials, and they actually provide some of these KPIs or benchmarks for calf mortality, morbidity, and they define stillbirths as between birth and 24 hours. So I got those sources confused.
Okay, then Katharina Berger asked if there is any difference in social housing systems between contract rearers versus dairies.
Yeah, and again, this is an unknown. So in our survey sample, there weren't as many custom heifer growers. It was mostly dairy farms responding. So we're not really able to distinguish between those in any kind of statistically significant way. But I would suspect that the answer is yes, where with these custom heifer growers, because they're bringing in calves from different source farms, there are different implications where you don't want to mix animals from different farms. And I would suspect almost all of those are using individual calf raising.
Yeah. And Viviana Apogliasa asked what concentration to consider to evaluate the number of liters that calves have to take. So
I think that question was for Julie.
I think that.
Well, did that regard then milk replacer usage then?
I would expect so, yes.
Yes. Well, I wouldn't be the best person to answer because I haven't worked with milk replacer at all, actually. But I think that's the reason why many Norwegian dairy farmers actually do not use milk replacer, because they think it's complex to mix it at the right way. And as Snorri also said, showing pictures of acidified milk, that's also been used in Norway a lot. And I think it's a good compromise, you know, and a good way to feed ad libitum milk to the dairy cows.
First time I saw it was in Norway, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So, and I've seen in the end of the list was a question also for Snorri about the use of milk replacer in China, why farmers don't use it. So maybe you can explain it.
Yeah,
just.
it's a good question. I think basically it's based on because they have enough milk from the cows, and also because of there has been some problems to import powder here,
Okay.
and we are using all the milk we can to sell. There is a deficit of milk in China. About 30% of the dairy products here are imported. So I think it basically also comes a little bit from that, but the tradition is also just to use. They don't know. They have never had this experience with powder milk. Yeah.
Okay. So then was a question if I think it's also for all speakers. Do you have any information if too low feeding levels in calves results in stress and increased cortisol levels? Do you know about a study about it?
Well, I could just, you know, the one study that I remember does not look on cortisol, but looks at the behavioral indicators of stress. So there are several studies showing that these calves that are fed low milk allowances are vocalizing more and performing more cross-sucking and also paying more unrewarded visits to the milk feeder. But I do not know of any studies looking at cortisol levels. Maybe Jennifer or Snorri knows.
Not off the top of my head, but I don't know that that would be the appropriate measure unless it was an abrupt change in the milk allowance, because with certain measures of cortisol, it's a better measure of acute stress, you know, following dehorning and those kinds of procedures. So I'm not aware of any, which doesn't mean that there aren't.
And maybe it's also difficult to differentiate between the housing conditions and also the feeding conditions, you know, concerning cortisol levels. Then what about the male's mortality rate in dairy herds? That's a question, I think, to all speakers.
I just pulled up a study. I was thinking more about the question about the difference in mortality and morbidity between dairy farms and custom calf ranches. And I didn't find a study directly comparing, but I did find one looking at these custom grower operations. And they found that farms that only raised heifers had a median mortality of 3%, whereas farms that raised both heifers and bull calves had a median of 4.5%. And so that would imply that perhaps mortality in bulls is a bit higher and is pulling that average up. So that's just one survey from 37 out of 50 states in the US.
Julie, do you have data from Norway?
No, not from the top of my head right now. I don't. And in our recent study, we did not differentiate between sex. We also only used herd level data. So I wouldn't know. But in Norway, I would estimate that half of the farmers rear the bull calves on farm, and half of them send the bull calves off farm for rearing.
Snorri, did you have some data on?
No, we don't. I don't have any data on this, but except the experience is that the bull cows are almost always sold away to like special farms, but we don't come there because that's not part of the dairy production anymore in a way. So I have no experience on this. Sorry.
Okay.
And likewise, we didn't collect those data in our survey. We were focused only on dairy replacement heifers, but again, the practices vary. So some do actually raise bull calves, most sell them, but now there is a shift in strategy to breeding beef dairy crossbreds. And so some farms will raise male calves for a beef market.
Yeah. It's a general discussion, I think, in most of the dairy countries now. Just to check that one. What's that? With the very high non-response rate, do you think that the responders were the ones that were most interested in calves, and there we had higher standards? Yeah, I think it's always a problem with the studies.
Yes, inevitably, that's the question. Some farmers will be ready to participate, and as Jennifer also mentioned, these are the farmers seeking information and maybe are more, flexible to make these changes. So yes, that's an absolute. It's a good point.
Yeah. So and then something about the water. It was, I think, Nina from Kaiserlinge as well. She was a bit shocked that so many farms don't provide water to the calves. So.
Yes, we were shocked as well, and even more shocked to find this association between lack of free water access and dairy herd calf mortality. And so this was an epidemiological and cross-sectional study, so we don't know, really the causes here. The causal relationship is not established in this study, but there's something with this measure that probably accounts for other management factors too. And I think, like I also saw that someone asked why are so many farmers not feeding water. And I think it comes down to some old myths that have been, alive among dairy farmers, and maybe especially in Norway, I don't know. But there have been two myths, I think, that are important here, and probably also more. But one of them would be that it's dangerous to feed more than 2 liters of milk in one meal. That's one myth. And some farmers also think that it's dangerous to allow calves free access of water because they can drink so much that they get diarrhea. And I've also heard many farmers say that, if the calves have diarrhea, then you should take away both milk and water, So these myths, I hope that we can slowly start to kill them as long the pace. But I'm really glad to hear that, for example, in China, you already have this strict guidelines that all calves should have free access to water, and so we should.
It's a company standard here. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we are working with the Norwegian Food Safety Authority now, and they are drafting already new legislations. So I'm hoping that it will be in place very soon, and that we can prevent calves from not having free access to water in the very near future.
Jennifer, what about the US? Do you have a regulation?
We don't have federal regulations, but we have industry expectations. So the farm program through National Milk, who invited me to speak here, actually, 98% of dairy farms participate in this program, and their latest standard is that pre-weaned calves need access to water by day 3. But of course, that compliance is highly variable, and part of it is these myths that Julie alluded to, but it's also some challenges with outdoor housing. So outdoor individual housing is the single most common, and in some regions, the water freezes in the winter. And so there's questions around, well, how can I show compliance if I offer the water to the calves and it freezes? Does that count as free access or not? How many times per day do I need to replenish it? So there's some practical limitations there where farms may offer water starting from the day of birth, but it's not really free access because it's frozen.
Yeah.
I can comment on this. This is the same in China. The farms in the north are of course in the wintertime they have a challenge on this, but they try to do it as well as they can, providing small batches of water 4, 5, 6 times between the milk meals. But it's a challenge for sure when it's freezing, of course.
So then a question for SNORRI. I think it's what are you basing your evaluation that they need to grow more than 800 grams per day to become good cows? I do not believe there is current data supporting this statement, since most models linking average daily weight gain, I think, Preweaning to future production cannot model these benefits in the high range of.
It's a good question. So there are basically two things. First of all, we're going for we're aiming for our heifers to calve at 22 months. So if we want them to grow fast and be mature timely, we need them to grow fast from the beginning. So that's one of the reasons. And the second reason is simply we keep data on our farms. Our best farms are producing about 44 to 48 kilos per cow per day. And these farms have all in common that their heifers are growing quite fast. So we are basically using the internal data here to try to promote good standards in the industry. It's not based on scientific research. It's just based on the facts we are gaining here. And our best farms are close to 15 tons average with 6,000 cows, and they are so we're copying the best practice inside China and spreading it to the other farms. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the reason that you provide so much milk to the calves, or more milk than the other farmers do, then the result is an increase in the weight gain. That's normal, I think. So you will not prevent.
That's how it should be.
Yeah. So, and there was another question. That's what the milk replacer, and then. Yeah, also to SNORRI, do you use some software or another system to track the calves?
I wish. No, we don't have. And the use, general use in China of software on dairy farms is quite limited, unfortunately. The bigger farming companies, there's one big farm company that has about 150,000 cows. They have some good systems on their farms, and the bigger the farm companies are, the more likely they are to have some kind of IT systems. But again, here everything needs to be in Chinese. Everything needs to be developed here or adapted. So it has been taking some time. This is a really young industry. As you saw in the picture, we are basically since 2007 we have been building up the industry here. So everything is still kind of new.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe that's one of the reasons the milk replacer is not here yet, because it's still so fresh. The tradition we have in Europe is not here.
Yeah. And then was the question: is frozen colostrum still preferred advice, or shouldn't we use something different?
I can tell
Yes.
from our side, we try to, of course, give always a fresh colostrum, but we rather want them to have a frozen colostrum with high quality on stock than using a bad colostrum or with low immunoglobulin in as a fresh one, because we have had some issues with calf health, and that's why we're trying to push the agenda for using having a bank with good quality colostrum in.
I think we are now over the time, but if you agree and if Maria agrees, then we can have another 5 minutes to answer the last questions, I hope. Here was one who was that? Graham. But most of the talk refers to heifer rearing. What happens to the bull calves? Yeah, that's they are moved to the fattening units, I think. Or so, and when calves are feeding with a bucket without a teat, can you see farms having non-nutritive teats to respond to suckling?
So we didn't ask that question in our survey, but it is something that we've been encouraging with my extension outreach work, that we understand some farms are very committed to bucket feeding, which is not the practice that I would recommend. I would recommend they switch over to teat feeding of milk for a number of reasons. But if they are committed to bucket feeding, yes, we've looked at the research and suggested that they provide these non-nutritive dummy teats. And another strategy that we recently found with some of the work by one of my master students is there's a device in the US called a Braden bottle. It's actually a bottle for grain, and it has a modified teat so that young calves can chew and suck on the teat and obtain some grain. And we found that they use that as a sort of dummy teat, and they were also consuming some solids that way. And it wasn't quite as effective at reducing abnormal oral behaviors compared to teat feeding of milk, but I have been suggesting these as alternative strategies if producers insist on bucket feeding.
That's actually quite interesting.
Then doesn't too much milk make the transition to solid food harder and lead to proper rumen development? It's always a question that's always coming from farmers, I think.
Yes, and it's a really good question. Like, first, I'd like to just say that in Norway, we didn't ask if they use a teat for their during the pre-weaning period or not, because we don't suspect that any farmers are still feeding with open buckets. And what was the second question?
Not only the one that if too much milk hinders the transition. Yeah.
There's a lot of new research showing that there are benefits with new innovative methods to wean calves when they are on high milk allowances. So more individualized weaning protocols are very good for, you know, allowing this individual variation, which is really in when the dairy calf starts eating concentrate. So I think with increased milk allowances, it's important to allow the cows maybe for a longer period to wean. But I think that research also shows that dairy cows actually start to eat concentrate, you know, at the age of maybe 4 weeks. They start to eat concentrate, and when they're weaned some weeks later, they actually eat surprisingly high amounts of concentrate, even though they're fed high milk allowances. And I see studies not finding these huge differences in daily concentrate intake, and also and they're performing very well at weaning, even though they had high milk allowances in the pre-weaning phase. So I think we shouldn't believe that this is a huge problem, but maybe make more weaning programs that are more individualized.
Yeah, but I think if we have only a few farms using automatic feeding systems, it's or milk feeding systems, it's difficult to keep these track on the milk intake and the concentrate intake, isn't it?
But I think also what is considered a high milk allowance is relative, right? That's changed. Our perspective has changed over the last few decades, where we still have this lingering advice to feed only 4 quarts, but now we know that there are a lot of negative welfare implications for doing so. And so, seconding what Julie said, yes, the research shows that calves fed higher milk allowances, however you define that, will need to be weaned a little bit later, but they do end up catching up and consuming solids. And so I think that there are ways to manage that quite successfully. And calves that are fed high milk allowances do start consuming solids even in the first week of life. It just takes longer for them to reach that same peak and hit those targets for how much you want them to consume before they're ready to wean. But again, coming from a welfare perspective, we think that the benefits outweigh any of those potential limitations, which we can overcome.
Completely agree with you. There is a point going in the same direction. Do you have recommendations about the longer of hay and straw farmers should give to calves to help rumen development and reduce abnormal behaviors? Do you know about studies concerning the hay consumption?
Yeah, there are recent studies showing that hay provision can reduce abnormal oral behaviors. In Canada, I think it's a bit more common than in the US if we're thinking about North America. So the USDA collected data about the average age at which calves are provided hay, and it's close to or after the time of weaning. It was something like 40 days, but they didn't ask when it was first provided. And how many farms actually were doing it. They only reported the average. So it's really atypical here, but sometimes there is, chopped roughage in the concentrate or starter mix, but it's not typical, even though, yes, research has shown there are potential welfare benefits. It's even further behind common practice, I would say, than increasing the milk allowances or social housing.
Yeah, well, I actually wish that I did ask our dairy farmers when they start to feed hay, because that's actually something that is stated in current legislation, that calves should have access to hay. So that's a huge, mismatch there. They should have access to hay, which don't like. I really know that it's important, but they should also have access to water. So current legislation should emphasize both access to hay and water. They are both very important for the development of the rumen. And I see that dairy cows, it's interesting to see how young they are when they start, chewing hay, and they do some kind of rumination, although it's different than the adult cow. But yeah, providing access is hugely important, both hay and also concentrate, I think.
Yeah, I think there is still a lot to do in education and also in getting data from the farmers. So I really enjoyed this webinar today, and I'd like to thank again all our speakers for these really good presentations and interesting studies they showed us today. And I like to thank Maria for her support before, during, and also after the webinar, I can say. And I'd like to thank all of you for listening today. And I hope I can, or I'm looking forward, I think we will meet again. I'm looking forward to welcome you at our next webinar, and I think it would be held at the beginning of next year. So please stay in contact and have a look for our course for the webinars. So thank you so much, and have a nice day, have a nice night, or have a nice evening wherever you are. Yeah. So goodbye.
You too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation.